On the 22nd of June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched the largest military land invasion in human history straight into the Soviet mainland. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, this operation would eventually lead to one of the bloodiest conflicts in all of World War II, taking tens of millions of casualties. But why? What was the Third Reich hoping to achieve with this operation? What was their aim with this whole thing, and why did they decide to attack the USSR in the middle of their conflict with the British Empire? To understand all these questions, we must go back to the year 1939, where this all began. On the 23rd of August, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was basically the Fuck Poland Pact, where they both agreed on partitioning Poland. After that was signed, just over a week later, Germany led a full-scale invasion into Poland alongside the Soviet Union, who joined in on the same month, and with their combined forces, they quickly overtook Poland. However, this invasion was not without consequences, as due to a series of escalating tensions between Britain and Germany, which finally reached the breaking point after Germany invaded Poland, Germany and the British Empire, alongside France as well, officially went to war, triggering World War II. Now don't be fooled into thinking that Germany and the Soviets were good friends now that they had both invaded Poland together. Far from it. Hitler absolutely hated communists as well as just Slavic people in general. He regarded them as Untermensch, which basically means subhuman in German. And for that reason, even as the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, were engaged in the Battle of Britain, Hitler already had his eyes on the Soviet Union. His goal was to obtain Lebensraum, which means living space. Basically, after invading the Soviet Union and taking their land, Germany would be able to use the vast amounts of land and exploit its resources to greatly increase the population of who he called the Aryan people of Germany. The plan was thus named Operation Barbarossa, named after the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. This all eventually culminated on June 22, 1941, when the operation was put into motion. The swarming German army alongside the immediate barrage carried out by the Luftwaffe, vastly reducing the Soviet ability to counterattack. And thus the beginning of the invasion went incredibly well for the Germans, with them taking an unbelievable amount of Soviet territory. Meanwhile, the Soviet army was in no position to properly fight back as they had been caught completely off guard by this invasion and kept getting pushed back. And due to the lack of good leadership, the Soviet forces repeatedly kept getting encircled, leading to the capture of hundreds of thousands of men. None of this was helped by the recent purges Stalin had just committed before the war, which resulted in most of the skilled military command being either killed or sent to the gulags, thus furthering the failures of the Soviet Union as it lacked good leadership on the Eastern Front. And as the German forces marched onto the doorsteps of Moscow on the brink of taking it, something miraculous happened for the Soviets. It got extremely cold, reminiscent of a certain someone, and also importantly, the battlefield got extremely muddy due to the recent rainfalls which made traversal very difficult, especially more so for the German tanks. And it's important to mention at this time that the Germans already had a bad situation with their supply lines as the Soviet peasants were forced to employ a scorched earth policy of destroying their buildings and driving the cattle away, thus depriving the Germans of the ability to exploit the resources of the lands they conquered as effectively, which they needed in order to sustain their advance. This situation drastically worsened due to the bad weather conditions. And due to all these problems, on the 31st of October, the German High Army Command issued orders to stop the offense on Moscow and to reorganize the troops. It was here the Soviets gained a brief but severely needed window which allowed them to divert their far eastern Siberian troops and bring them to the Eastern Front in order to fight the Germans. As to Stalin, it became clear that there was no longer a threat from the Japanese Empire, as they clearly chose to instead focus on the Southeast Asian campaign, and thus there would be no threat of a Japanese invasion of the Soviet Union. And coupled in with the fact that they had already signed a non-aggression treaty between themselves, thus further mitigating the risk. Just over 2 weeks go by, and the window of time allotted to the Soviets was now over. And now, with the ground hardening due to the cold weather, the Germans resumed their attack on Moscow on the 15th of November. But now, with the weather devolving into full-blown Soviet winter and the worsening supply shortages for the Germans, the tides seem to be shifting in favor of the Soviets in the most critical moment. And that's exactly what happened. The Germans managed to reach as close as 24 kilometers away from Moscow. So close, in fact, to where some soldiers even claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance. But by this point, it was already well too late. The newly arrived Siberian troops were already well adapted to fighting in extremely cold conditions, as they were from Siberia, and which now finally allowed the Soviets to halt the German advance once and for all. And it was then the Soviets pulled the biggest Uno reverse card in history by launching a massive counteroffensive on the 5th of December, pushing the Germans back further and further, and just barely saving Moscow from the brink of capture. After all this was said and done, it became clear that the Germans had lost the battle for Moscow, and that the invasion had thoroughly and undeniably failed, ultimately causing the German armies over 800,000 men in the process, which would end up being the turning point in the war for the Allies, and signal the end for Nazi Germany, as well as their Eastern ambitions. In the end, Hitler believed that the Soviets were a weak-minded and inferior people who would collapse as soon as the Germans kicked the door in. However, this notion could not be further from the truth, as the Soviets ended up putting the Germans through a massive war of attrition, which the Germans were sorely unprepared for, leading to the failures of Operation Barbarossa. Ultimately, Hitler's assumptions about the Soviets would be one of the many mindsets that would ultimately lead to the demise of the Third Reich in World War II.